Hi, I'm Sam Scheitler from Clark Mortgages. I'm a mortgage broker specialising in more complex cases. In particular, I deal with a lot of investors, portfolio landlords, and I just want to share a bit of my experience. How do you build a portfolio? Generally, you start with one, you get to two, you get to three, and so on and so forth. But really, to do it at pace, you can do it a couple of different ways. Some people are completely willing to naturally aggregate money, and they save or they earn or however they deal with it. And when they have money put aside, they invest in a new buy-to-let. And generally, you do find portfolios are a snowballing effect because ultimately more money in your pocket means a quicker time to save up. But I do think there's a more efficient way of dealing with it. You do have to look at it from a safety point of view. Do you necessarily always want to be over encumbered? No. But it's relative to your income, isn't it? Someone who's earning £100,000 a year might be much more willing to take on £500,000 worth of buy-to-let debt that's being covered by tenants anyway, compared to someone who's earning £20,000. The scale is completely different. Lenders look at your portfolio as a whole. If you've dealt in buy-to-lets before, if you've dealt in rental properties, generally speaking, the rule is outside of a minimum income requirement for certain lenders, does the property finance itself? So when the tenant pays the mortgage, after tax is paid, at an interest rate of X amount above the mortgage, is it possible then to pay the mortgage off? But if we look at a portfolio on the whole, the lender is going to become concerned about the other properties. You may be investing in that one property, but they want to know that the properties in the background aren't going to endanger and encroach upon their investment. If you've got multiple different investors or lenders involved, that starts to become a bit of a concern. So generally looking at your portfolio, some lenders on what we call the more vanilla side of the market are going to say, well, we can lend you 75% to the value of that property, but we want to make sure that your mortgage is only at 65% overall, for instance. A lot of lenders are much more flexible. They might say, we don't care how much you owe against the rest of the portfolio as long as it self-finances. But as I always say, flexibility comes at price. So you've got to consider, well, do I want to be at the cheapest end of the market? And generally people who are more averse to risk and who are more slowly engaging in the growth of their portfolio are going to be there. And the ones who are quite aggressively growing their portfolio are then going to be on the other side of the fence. They're going to be dealing with the lenders who don't care as long as the property cash flows. And cash flow is very important from a portfolio standpoint. At a certain point, it stops becoming a passive investment, a portfolio, and it becomes a business. So once you start looking at multiple properties, they start looking at business plans, because at that point, you aren't just dabbling in having a couple of properties for retirement. You are investing in a business because you believe that property has, long-term effects on income, because you want to benefit from equity growth or from passive income flow or what have you. However that is, you're going to justify it in a business plan typically, or a broker will for you as well if they're dealing with it. Cash flow is important because it's all well and good if that property cash flows. If your other clients, your other tenants aren't paying you, well, that's going to impact your ability to pay their mortgage. And on top of that, they look at reserves. So this is a common issue I see. People move on so aggressively that all of their money goes into putting into a new property. And the reality is, yes, it's a passive income, but if that tenant weren't to pay for whatever reason, and as I've said in other videos, life happens. You can't expect people to always be of good health, to always be in work, or just to want to pay you. The reality is that if you are in property long enough, you're going to have rental voids. It might not even be that the tenant doesn't pay you, you just don't get a tenant in, and so it's empty. How then are you paying the mortgage in the time where that property is empty? And that's either going to be from cash flow or from reserves. And it's much easier to prove reserves than it is to prove cash flow in the grand scheme of things. That's just a pot of money that you have to show to a lender. People talk about diversification of a portfolio. I think more and more people are leaning that way. I've been to so many property conferences and people really have many, many different ideas of that. I'm no expert in property investment. I'm an expert in property mortgages. Some people talk about do one thing and do it well. You know, get into HMOs, get into holiday lets and nail them every time. And people use the same structure and so on and so forth. They adopt almost like a franchise mentality of repeating the same working model over and over again. And that can absolutely work. Other people do a little bit of this, that, and the other, and they diversify. I do think that's got a place in the market as well, because I've been doing this for so long that I've seen people go through the trend of, back in 2015, pretty much everyone was in single lets, and there were a few people dabbling in what we call HMOs, which is, you know, houses of multiple occupation. So that's student lets and professional lets. It's properties let by the room. And then more and more people moved into that. And then COVID hit, you know, dreaded COVID, and we came out of that and it became difficult to travel. All of a sudden people were doing staycations. So everybody started getting into holiday lets and serviced accommodation. And then we moved on, and because the interest rates became higher, I've got more and more people dealing with long-term housing association lets because they want the stability of payment, or they want mixed-use properties. They want commercial floors with flats above because they can benefit from long corporate leases and so on. Diversifying a portfolio probably means you're less subject to the whims of the market, the next go-to thing. And the same probably could be said for location. There are lenders that will actually look negatively on a portfolio if you've got too many in the same location, or it might just mean that they want to distribute their risk and so they won't lend on it even if they've lent on previous ones on the same road. So it's just something to consider. It's a strategy thing, really. It's, are you comfortable putting your eggs in one basket and really committing to it and doing it well, or do you want to mitigate risk and distribute it around? We talk so much to the clients about growing their portfolio, and the slowest way to grow it, in my view, is to save up, you know, with the money you earn every single month from your employment, and you save up and you save up and you buy a new buy-to-let. But it's a very safe way. You know, you've saved and you've bought a new property. What we do to accelerate people's growth, however, is that, you know, we borrow that mortgage against that property. That property now, when they buy it, is worth 150,000. We've gone through property booms where property increased at a rate of 10, 15% in a year. And 2 years later, their fixed rate was ending. And that same property, without them having done much to that property, was now worth 190 or 200,000 pounds. And the benefit to leveraging the equity there is we can refinance that mortgage as long as it's still affordable, as long as the rent still covers it. And the reality is property prices increased, rent increased along with it, so it still was affordable. We were then able to pull out money from that property via a remortgage, which is not a realised gain, meaning no tax involved. And that property then, from 150 with a mortgage of 75%, which is 112,500, increased up to 200,000, which is a 75% mortgage of 150. That client had 37,500 pounds to then invest into new property. Another property worth, you know, 150,000 pounds, for instance. Really interesting, because that then accelerates them just by holding property, which is why so many people look to acquire property so quickly first. Because if you acquire property in a really short amount of time, you can then sit on it over time, and the overall trend is that property goes up. Can we speak for, will property go up forever? No, but you know, it's the same with the stock market. You make an educated guess based on history and based on what you hope is going to happen, and you decide, am I willing to put my eggs in that basket? And once you're a portfolio landlord, like I say, it is a business. So at that point, have you built your team? Have you got your broker involved? Someone you can call up any time of day, who's got a file, who's receptive, who's able to say, yep, you can afford that. This is your figures. Here it is by the end of the day. Have you got that working relationship with someone to be able to do that immediately? Have you got a solicitor who's going to pick up, who's going to be grateful for your work, and is willing to put your case to the top of their file? And have you got an accountant who's responsive, who understands property tax as well, so that, you can structure what you're doing properly? So yeah, it's a complex market, but growing a portfolio isn't necessarily difficult. It's just, how quickly do you want to do it? The quicker something happens, the riskier it is, generally speaking. So you've got to balance that out. Is it worth taking the risk? And if the answer is yes and you want to do it, look at refinancing, look at growing that way.